Tantor Audio, a division of Recorded Books, presents The Herods, Murder, Politics, and the Art of Succession by Bruce Chilton, narrated by Paul Heitsch. Preface. The Herodian dynasty was complex, conflicted, and compelling. So is the considerable scholarship that approaches the vivid figures responsible for its emergence and demise. I would not have taken up the issue of the Herodians' impact on governance without considerable encouragement, moral support, and practical help from many colleagues. An afternoon's conversation with Joan Bingham brought vividly alive the interest that Herod the Great, always the center of the narrative, could evoke in acute listeners. A series of experimental forays, guided by Gail Ross and Ken Wapner, led to the conclusion that the issue of governance was much larger than Herod himself, big though he was, and that the arc of the dynasty needs to be traced for its political impact to be assessed. Just as this finding came home to me, I was finishing my study of the resurrection of Jesus, another topic whose complexity is a challenge. The editor, Carrie Newman, exerted a catalytic influence on my address of the issues involved and my approach to presenting them. In the case of the Herodians, Carrie's contribution has been even greater, as we have devised a way to coordinate the moving parts of the Herodian machine. In deciding how to anticipate listeners' interests, as well as where to explain more and where to leave matters for inference, I have been greatly helped by Francis Carrigodens, a student at Bard College, as well as by Carrie. Francis read the proofs of resurrection logic, showing editorial skills in the process, so it was natural to involve him earlier on in the composition of The Herods, Murder, Politics, and the Art of Succession. Library staff at Bard College have provided me with unfailing support, even during the worst days of the pandemic in New York State. The director, Betsy Cawley, provides an example of how institutions, however stressed, need not fail under the pressure of events. In taking on authorly accountability for the inevitable faults that works of history are heir to, I am heartened that I have no responsibility whatever for the lapses of Josephus, the principal source for all work of this kind. These are so striking that a scholarly literature, some of it cited here, has developed to account for all his apparent bêtises. Typically, the problem is addressed by considering his perspective first, and then applying that analysis to what Josephus says. Here, I prefer to analyze his individual assertions of fact before coming to an assessment in regard to his aims, which appears in the epilogue. Since he was himself a political player and militant leader near the end of the events he narrates, his actions, like those of the Herodians he both admired and criticized, shaped his preferred theory of governance at least as much as his theory guided his actions. Power, like the resurrection, generates its own characteristic logic in the 1st century as in the 21st. Bruce Chilton, Feast of Aidan of Lindisfarne. Introduction. In August 2000, I went swimming for the first time in the Mediterranean Sea at the beach in Tel Aviv. On an oppressively hot and humid day, signs posted in Hebrew on jetties along the beach cautioned against going in the water and warned that there was no lifeguard. Still, the weather was too stifling to ignore the lure of the impressive waves that crushed in. Because I grew up on Long Island, I have a long-standing habit both of appreciating opportunities to swim and of ignoring signs. In any case, there were some other swimmers that day already in the water, none of whom seemed to struggle. The Mediterranean Sea has a different taste from the Long Island Sound or the Atlantic Ocean. The salt itself stings more on the tongue, and the water is warmer. The waves that day were more distinct still. Because the Mediterranean is long and relatively narrow, and Tel Aviv sits on its eastern end, a storm far out of sight can whip up the impressive breakers that had drawn me into the water, and they are funneled toward the beach. In addition, the drop from the beach into the water is steeper than in the case of the Atlantic Ocean, and more like the Long Island Sound with its smaller waves. As I found, once in the water, this makes for a strong shear of forces, with the waves' tops pressing into the beach and an undertow dragging the broken waves back out. It did not take long for me to become much cooler, invigorated, but also quite tired, and I made my way back on foot through town. The Herodian dynasty rolled through the lands of territorial Israel like a series of breakers. Herod the Great, his father Antipater, Herod's sons Archelaus, Antipas, and Philip, his extraordinarily lucky grandson Agrippa I, his great-grandchildren Berenike and Agrippa II, were all forces unto themselves, breakers that threatened what stood in their way. Yet they also were part of a single dynastic complex, whose force is explicable not only in terms of their talent and ambition and drive, all of which remain astonishing, but also on the basis of Rome's projection of its might, sometimes blatantly and to the point of violence, sometimes cloaked in the claims of legitimacy of local rulers, like the Herodians, who did their bidding. The breakers on the eastern end of the Mediterranean are absorbed back into the sea from which they emerged, and the Herodian dynasty, by the end of the 1st century CE, was submerged within the Roman imperium that had largely produced it. But in the caesura between their appearance and disappearance, the Herodians made their influence felt on their subjects, among whom were formative figures in the emergence of Judaism and Christianity. Until his death in 4 BCE, Herod the Great ruled lands that included territories that once made up the kingdoms of Judea and Israel. Although he exercised his monarchy over a rich, strategically crucial territory, his royal title did not derive from heredity. His family came from the people of Idumea, ancient antagonists of the Israelites. Herod and his dynasty framed the basis of their authority at the same time that they ruled, wielding power ruthlessly to maintain and extend their hold on their often fractious, sometimes fiercely rebellious subjects. Yet Herod ruled not as an outsider, but on the basis of a family commitment to Judaism going back to his grandfather and his father. 3 generations had served the priestly dynasty of the Maccabees that had submitted Idumea to their rule, helping implement the Maccabean version of what loyalty to the Torah required. Herod's father, Antipater, rose not only to manage affairs on behalf of his priestly masters, but to become a pivotal military leader. He inaugurated a new lineament of power, alliance with Rome in the persons of Pompey and Julius Caesar. In the crucible of civil war among Romans as the First Triumvirate broke up and international war between Rome and Parthia became ambient, Antipater managed to leave his sons with the prospect of a dynasty. With a dexterity that became a dynastic trait, Antipas managed to secure just enough stability to secure a position of governance within the volatile changes of political and military conditions. Antipater achieved success not by compromise, but by choosing sides and then ferociously standing by his choice. He ruled Idumea on behalf of the Maccabees, preferring their priestly theocracy to the Hellenizing regime of the Seleucids to the east. That choice involved supporting the Maccabean monarchy over the objections of Jewish groups such as the Essenes. Their reaction to both Maccabean and then Herodian hegemony helped shape their characteristic theology of divine rule. As Antipater set about establishing a dynasty for his family, however, the Maccabees themselves fell into internecine civil war. Antipater remained loyal to the high priest Hyrcanus, whose victory ultimately depended on the incursions of the Romans under Pompey. That great general became the first example among many of Rome's alliances with Antipater and his successors. Herod inherited the twin pillars of loyalty to Judaism and loyalty to Rome that became the basis of Herodian rule. He was Antipater's second son, born after and subordinate to Phasael, the finest diplomat of the family. Herod inherited his father's audacity and dash, alongside more skill in horsemanship than any of his relatives. But he sorely lacked judgment in the first phase of his career, a trait made all the more obvious by a relentless ambition that never left him. As long as Antipater and Phasael guided him, the worst results of his deficiency in judgment could be contained. Antipater's policy of loyalty to the Romans brought the family into an alliance with Julius Caesar, whose cousin, named Sextus Caesar, developed a particular liking for the extravagant young Herod. While Antipater had turned down the title of king offered to him by Julius Caesar, and ruled instead as procurator, Herod acted arrogantly after his brilliant campaign to subjugate Galilee by ordering the immediate execution of the rebel leader Hezekiah. That brought him into conflict with the Sanhedrin in Jerusalem, which claimed capital jurisdiction. When Herod came to appear before that body in the temple, many in the Pharisaic faction feared that they faced a pretender to the royal title. Pharisees did not come into existence because of or in spite of Herod, but their view of how God intended governance developed during generations of Herodian rule. For all his ambition, Herod would never have chosen the path he actually took to become a king. His father's death by assassination put a series of unlikely events in motion. He learned to use subterfuge to exact revenge on his father's killer, and also resorted to the politics of marriage in the manner of Rome by arranging a marriage with a young Maccabean princess. Another member of that family, however, a would-be high priest named Antigonus, allied with the Parthians to expel the Romans as well as Phasael and Herod from their governance of the land of Israel. Phasael, in fact, committed suicide in Parthian custody, and Herod was brought to the brink of defeat. But he made his way to Rome, where the royal diadem was bestowed on him by Antony and Octavian before the Senate. Herod had elevated Antipater's opportunism into a political masterstroke. That, in theory, made him king of the Jews, a status that became a reality on the ground after the grisliest fighting of his long career. During Herod's time, Roman power itself took its imperial form. As Octavian ruled, of course, he took the title Augustus, in keeping with his devotion to his adoptive father's cult of the divine Julius. Imperial power was a theocratic assertion as well as a dominant military, economic, and political force. Herod framed a version of theocratic ambition all his own. He had married the Maccabean princess named Miriam in order to produce heirs that would rule both Rome's sanction and the temple's mandate. He deliberately crafted a dynastic claim grounded in Roman might and Israelite theocracy. That unlikely hybrid was the key to the Herodians' surprising longevity in power during the most chaotic century in the political history of Judaism in the land of Israel. Herod's dynastic ambition peaked when he consummated his marriage to Miriam, producing heirs who were literally Maccabean royalty. His marriage to his princess happened as Antony's liaison with Cleopatra became fully public, and evidenced no less passion. Cleopatra, however, coveted Herod's lands and his friendship with Antony. When Octavian emerged as the victor after Actium, Herod also triumphed, despite his relationship with Antony. The transition to empire only strengthened Herod's hand and his good standing with Augustus. By then, however, Herod's suspicion of Maccabees in his own entourage had put him on a murderous course, which saw him assassinate or execute his own relations, including Miriam's brother and Miriam herself. Herod ultimately ordered Miriam killed by strangulation, and their relationship exemplifies Herod's resort to intrigue and violence, as well as the self-consuming hubris he brought to every aspect of his rule. Once his sons had grown, she herself was dispensable, but Herod ordered the execution of even those sons for alleged conspiracy. In any case, his total of 10 wives had provided ample progeny. Increasingly, he ruled as an imperial client, collided with his Pharisaic opposition, and, as he approached death, confused his own legacy with vicious executions and a series of contradictory wills that named different sons as his successors. Despite the chaos Herod produced at the end of his life, his dynastic project survived him, becoming a controlling political reality within his territories until the end of the 1st century CE. None of this worked out smoothly, and one of the two main purposes of this book is to relate a complicated history in a coherent way. Recent scholarship has detailed Herod's personal tragedy, and has also shown how his entire family developed and tailored his project of governance within the changing politics of Rome, Judea, Galilee, and international Judaism. Herod and his offspring knew how to play the politics of God, and here their narratives are woven together instead of being treated as separate topics, as in the specialist literature which is cited. They played a ruthless game, eliminating enemies as they went, Jews and Gentiles, Egyptians and Parthians, distant relations, and close family. Their violence and their sophistication complemented one another, as they consolidated the power of their dynasty by means of military prowess and political skill, and projected their dominance by resorting to public spectacle, massive projects of building and charity, and their appropriation of the traditional symbols of Israelite power. This was the epoch of Herod the Great, a period extending from the emergence of his father, Antipater, as a governor, and ending with the deaths of Berenike and Agrippa II, Herod's great-grandchildren. As the Herodians negotiated an always explosive set of forces, defining movements in Judaism emerged, each with its own conception of political theology. Essenes, Pharisees, Sadducees, priestly nationalists, revolutionaries, Christians, and ultimately Zealots, all held their particular views of theocratia, a term that the general and historian Josephus invented to explain the different strands of his religion. In every case, they framed their theocratic perspective within a Herodian environment, to which they adapted. Whether that adaptation was positive or negative, the demand for some response, cooperative or resistant, proved inexorable. The Herodians appropriated elements from some theocratic models, resisted others, and unleashed genocidal violence against opponents who invoked a divine warrant for their own revolutionary programs. Herod's son Archelaus, in an attempt to imitate his father's final phase of governance, became a model of Herodian cruelty. Herod's first son by his Samaritan wife Maltheke, Archelaus was designated to inherit the royal title by the terms of the dying king's last will. He pressed the dynastic claim to monarchy by organizing a magnificent funeral for his father, flaunting his own status as Herod's rightful heir. But his own brother, Antipas, contested the will and was supported in his challenge before Augustus himself by Herod's sister, Salome, and even Maltheke, mother of both Archelaus and Antipas. Worse, factions among the Pharisees and Sadducees hardened in their opposition until militant resistance to both Archelaus and Rome emerged. Archelaus responded by means of the undiscriminating use of force, often unleashing disproportionate devastation against opponents, real and imagined. Augustus, who had supported Archelaus out of loyalty to the memory of Herod, wearied of the persistent rebellions in Judea, and finally exiled Archelaus and ordered direct Roman rule by means of a prefect within Judea proper, while Archelaus's brothers, Antipas and Philip, continued to rule as tetrarchs of their territories, Galilee and Gaulonitis. Whether a given Herodian ruler was cruel or generous, effective or useless, gifted or limited, their subjects could not ignore them. Yet those who study Judaism and Christianity today typically treat them as a matter of background, when, in fact, the Herodians were in the foreground of political power. Various models of theocracy that have long been recognized, as from the Essenes' War of the Sons of Light against the Sons of Darkness to Jesus' vision of the Kingdom of God, were not abstract assertions but living alternatives to Herodian power. Tracing the relationship between the Herodian project and political theologies within Judaism and Christianity is the second main purpose of this book. The Herodians have exerted an outsized influence compared to the territory and forces they commanded, because strands of Judaism long survived them. Among these survivals, of course, Christianity also emerged, and each of the key figures within that movement, Jesus, James, the brother of Jesus, and Paul among them, dealt with a different inflection of Herodian power. For this reason, Herod's successors, above all his sons, Archelaus, Antipas, and Philip, his grandson, Agrippa I, and his great-grandchildren, Agrippa and Berenike, were all vital influences on the emergence of Christianity. The competitors and victims of the Herodian project are as fascinating as the Herodians themselves. Many of them contributed to models of governance that exercise influence until this day. No Herodian pursued advancement toward the dynastic end more persistently than Antipas. Disappointed in his attempt to be named king of Judea in a hearing before Augustus to adjudicate Herod the Great's will, and again after Archelaus was deposed, Antipas contented himself with shoring up his position as tetrarch of Galilee and Perea. With stolid effectiveness, he rebuilt Sepphoris after the occupation of Judas the Galilean and made a marriage alliance with the king of Nabatea. After Augustus's death and the accession of Tiberius, Antipas's ambition burned anew. He married Herodias, daughter of Herod's son Aristobulus, and therefore a Maccabean heiress. She was already married to Antipas's brother Philip, and the union was criticized by John the Baptist. Just as Antipas eliminated John in Machaerus, he sought to dispose of John's disciple Jesus in Galilee. He only achieved the latter aim in Jerusalem, however, by means of a strategic alliance with the prefect of Jerusalem, Pontius Pilate. With John and Jesus dealt with, and his brother Philip dead, Antipas seemed secure in his reach for the royal title, provided the aging Tiberius would reward decades of loyal service yoked with smoldering ambition. Agrippa I, grandson of Herod the Great and son of Aristobulus, formed an intimate friendship with Caligula, Tiberius's heir by adoption. When Tiberius died, Agrippa suddenly became the Herodians' golden boy. Caligula named his friend to Philip's former tetrarchy, but as king. When Antipas petitioned Caligula to be named king of his own tetrarchy, false charges by Agrippa instead ensured that the emperor banished Antipas altogether. With that, Agrippa I became king of Galilee and Perea as well. The new king used his influence on behalf of Judaism, and was a key figure in convincing Caligula to rethink and delay his order to set up a statue of himself in the temple. Only Caligula's assassination, however, spared Jerusalem this abomination of desolation. Mark chapter 13, verse 14. In the transition to Claudius as emperor, Agrippa proved himself useful and was rewarded with the inheritance of the whole realm of Herod the Great, again as king. Lavish spending, skillful diplomacy, and, like Claudius, selective persecution of minorities, such as Jesus' followers, earned Agrippa admiration and broad success. His single greatest misfortune was his health, however, and his premature death threw Judea into confusion. Amid a rising tide of rebellion, Claudius resorted to the appointment of procurators rather than prefects, whose increased authority was nonetheless inadequate to the rising tide of revolt. The turbulence of the period after Agrippa I, as well as a concern for his son's inexperience, prevented Claudius from appointing Agrippa II in his stead. The reticence was shown to be justified, because when Agrippa II did finally come into power over parts of Herod and Agrippa I's old realm, he administered it tentatively, merely as a Roman client. In stark contrast, there was nothing tentative about his sister, Berenike. Twice married by the time of Agrippa I's death, she and her sister Drusilla continued to forge marriages to advance the dynastic cause. But no spouse was as interesting to Berenike as her brother, and, despite rumors of incest, she left a third husband to rejoin Agrippa II's court. In that setting, she and her brother attempted to moderate legal action against the Apostle Paul, but neither that prosecution nor the extralegal execution of James could be prevented. The temple occupied a position at the center of controversy and increasingly saw violence. The last procurator before open war with Rome broke out, Gessius Florus, overreacted while Agrippa II was in Egypt on a diplomatic mission, a crucial moment when revolt might have been averted. But Berenike stood in the eye of the storm in Jerusalem, undertaking a Nazirite vow, and she attempted to mitigate the procurator's tactics. Even with Agrippa II's belated arrival and his support of his sister's approach, the revolt came. When it did, Berenike and Agrippa alike supported the general Vespasian and his son Titus, both of whom acceded to the position of emperor as their Flavian dynasty came to power. Berenike began an affair with Titus that was no passing liaison, and became the basis of speculation from Jerusalem to Rome that the Herodian dynasty would join with the Flavians to shape a new settlement for the empire as a whole. Berenike, the most prominent figure in her generation of the Herodians, brought the dynastic ambition to its most extensive aspiration. At the same time, the surprising resonance between, on the one hand, the Herodians and their apologists, and, on the other hand, Roman conceptions of providential governance emerge at the close of the narrative. Berenike, certainly the most religious and perhaps the most ambitious of all the Herodians, consummated her affair with the Roman general Titus as he besieged the Second Temple. When he became emperor, she was his consort. However controversial that relationship, she brought her family, and Judaism itself, to the verge of a completely new form of power. Berenike embodied not only the Herodians' passion to rule, but also their challenging insistence that religion and politics, far from separable, are embedded with one another. Although they pursued their ambition with characteristic audacity and a unique set of resources, talents, and opportunities, the dynasty also brought out of their subjects and their collaborators a common quest for theokratia that is the topic of the epilogue. 1. Antipater, a noble Idumean mercenary, founds a dynasty. Antipater, father of Herod the Great, navigated the conflicting forces of his time by choosing sides and then fiercely standing by his choices. He ruled Idumea on behalf of the Maccabees, preferring their priestly theocracy to the Hellenizing regime of the Seleucids. That choice involved supporting the Maccabean monarchy over the objections of Jewish groups such as the Essenes. As Antipater set about establishing a dynasty for his family, however, the Maccabees themselves fell into internecine civil war. Antipater remained loyal to the high priest Hyrcanus, whose victory ultimately depended on the incursion of the Romans under Pompey. That great general became the first example, among many, of Rome's alliance with Antipater and his successors. The founder, loyal, adept, generous, fearless, gifted commander of eclectic forces. Setting: a rocky, red clay kingdom stretched south of Judea from the Sinai Peninsula to beyond the Dead Sea. Israelites had called it Edom, which means red in their language. Despite close trading and ethnic relationships between the two nations, Edom warred frequently with Israel. Biblical legend had it that the people of Edom descended from Esau, the slightly elder of the patriarch Isaac's two sons. The book of Genesis says that at his birth Esau was red or ruddy like his land, and also hairy. Genesis chapter 25, verse 25. A born outdoorsman. Esau's younger twin brother Jacob, who was also given the name Israel as an adult, Genesis chapter 32, verse 28, tricked Esau out of his birthright as Isaac's principal heir. Genesis recounts the trick in two different ways, each derived from its own source. In one, Esau returns from hunting so famished that he is willing to trade anything for the vegetable stew that his domesticated younger brother has prepared. Jacob agrees to give him some at the price of...
Sample complete. Ready to continue?